Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. I would ask everyone here in the house if you'll make that last courtesy check as we prepare to begin that cell phones have been turned off. It's always appreciated. And of course, our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments throughout our presentations, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. We will then, of course, post the program on our website following today's presentation for your future reference. And make sure as well before you leave that you do get a copy of the Index, our newest publication. Introducing our program today is Dr. James J. Carafano. He serves as Vice President of our Catherine and Shelby Cullom Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy. He is also the E.W. Richardson Fellow. He is a graduate of West Point and a 25-year veteran of the Army. He oversees all of Heritage's defense, national security, and foreign policy agenda. He serves as a senior fellow at the George Washington University's Homeland Security Policy Institute. He is also on the Board of Trustees of the Marine Corps University Foundation, as well as advisory boards for the West Point Center of Oral History, the Hamilton Society, the Operation for Renewed Hope Foundation. He serves as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University and the Institute of World Politics. Please join me in welcoming Jim Carafano. Jim?
First of all, let me thank all of you for joining us today. I think this is a historic effort. As historic as in the 1930s when Winston Churchill was relegated to the backbench. They called it the wilderness years, and he decided to dedicate the little political capital he had and all of his courage and all of his commitment to trying to really understand the state of military competition in Western Europe in the 1930s. Because Churchill understood, I think, more than anyone, that, that this was a great turning point in history, and to not get it right, to not understand the nature of the competition and the challenges that posed for the peace and prosperity ahead was something that not only Britain, but that the world could ill afford to do. And so when other people didn't care, Winston Churchill did. And many of you probably remember the great debates over the aviation estimates in the 1930s and the state of German military power versus the West. And not only was there a debate, there was a conscious effort to actually obfuscate the truth, to actually make people not understand what the reality. And nobody was more committed to that than the Germans, who in the late 1930s and early 1940s invested enormous efforts in a huge propaganda campaign to actually lie and intimidate the French people and convince them that German power was rising so quickly and so rapidly that France would have no choice if there was a war but to capitulate. So the notion that we went through that very, very dangerous decade and we never really had a common understanding of where we were, I think was one of the great contributing factors to the Second World War. And I don't think that's anything that anybody should ever be sanguine about, least of all now. I think if there's one thing that we can agree on in the last decade is that we are completely unsure of what is the nature of American military power today, and where does it stand reference the missions, the requirements it has to provide for the prosperity and the protection of the American people. So it was in that spirit that the Heritage Foundation about 18 months ago started a project to understand the nature of U.S. military strength, and today you'll see the first edition of that. And our goal over time is to each year to produce an estimate which is based on standardized criteria so we can measure from year to year the nature of U.S. military power and where it stands in the world. Doesn't answer all the questions, doesn't tell you what the strategy is, doesn't tell you how big the defense budget ought to be, but it does tell you where you are relative to where you were the year before and where you have been over time. I think that is something which is sorely needed, and I am incredibly honored and in awe and admiration of the research team that worked to put this effort together. So let me just walk you through very quickly the sequence of events that we're going to do today, and then we're just going to kick it off. So to begin with, I'm going to introduce the leadership of the research team that put this effort together. And then I'm going to turn it over to Dakota, who's going to come up, and he is going to introduce you to the excuse me, Heritage Foundation U.S. Military Index. Randy Forbes, Congressman Forbes, is going to come and make some remarks, and I believe he's going to take some questions as well. And then after Congressman Forbes, We're going to bring up the heads of our 3 institutes and Dakota, and they will have an opportunity to kind of go into more detail and answer any questions you might have on the index and how it was put together and what it's be useful for. So let me begin with a great deal of pride and admiration, introducing you to the leaders who really championed this effort, starting with Dakota Wood, who is the editor of our index. And I think just going to introduce them all now, and then you'll see them all come up in just a bit. So Dakota served for 2 decades in the U.S. Marine Corps and is now our Senior Research Fellow for Defense Programs at the Heritage Foundation. He retired from the Marine Corps as Lieutenant Colonel in 2005, having enjoyed a 20-year career during which he served in a variety of operational units and various high-level staff assignments. He also served as a Senior Fellow for the the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, which is also something I did early in my career, where he organized and materially contributed to numerous seminar-style war games conducted on a diverse array of topics and papers. And most recently, Dakota served as a strategist for the U.S. Marine Corps Special Operations Command. So he is a person who I've really come to admire in the course of putting this together with the over 20 analysts from the Heritage Foundation that brought all kinds of expertise into this project. So also joining our panel later is Niall Gardner, who is the director of the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. Niall is not only the director, his key areas of specialization include the Anglo-American Special Relationship, the United Nations, post-war Iraq, the role of Great Britain and Europe, and the U.S.-led alliance against international terrorism in rogue states, including Iran. And he was recently named one of the 50 most influential Britons in the United States by the London Daily Telegraph, which is now OBE because Niall's now officially an American citizen, so I guess he falls off the list. As a leading authority on transatlantic relations, Niall has advised the executive branch of the U.S. government on a range of key issues, from the role of international allies in Iraq to the war on terrorism. His policy papers are widely read on Capitol Hill, where he is regularly sought after for advice on major foreign policy issues. He has testified before Congress several times. He frequently briefs delegations of political leaders and journalists from across the world, and he has served as an expert on the 2005 Gingrich-Mitchell Congressional Task Force on the United Nations. Prior to joining Heritage in 2002, Niall was a foreign policy researcher for the former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Working in her private office, Gardner assisted Lady Thatcher in her book Statecraft, Strategies for a Changing World, published by HarperCollins. He served as an aide from 2000 to 2002 and advised her on a number of international issues. And I also point out he is the author of an outstanding book on Margaret Thatcher's leadership, which I would commend to everyone. Steve Bucci is the director of the Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy and National Security Studies in the Davis Institute. He served for 3 decades in the U.S. Army as a Special Forces officer and a top Pentagon official. His research and writing focuses on cybersecurity, special operations, and defense support to civil authorities. He joined the think tank as a senior research fellow for defense and Homeland Security in April 2012 and was promoted to director of the Allison Center in December of 2012, so which I think, is one of the fastest promotions. He's in charge of the group of issues that fall under our Protect America initiative. He was previously the lead consultant at IBM on cybersecurity. He's published numerous articles and related issues, and is for a leading national security blog. He's a sought-after speaker on cybersecurity. In the Army, he was commander of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Special Forces, and led deployments to Eastern Africa, South Asia, and the Persian Gulf, including Operation Desert Thunder in 1998 in response to Saddam Hussein's threat to violate the no-fly zone over Iraq. He's a seasoned leader in the 82nd Airborne, 5th and 7th Special Forces, and in his most trying combat duty ever, he was a military assistant to Secretary Rumsfeld in the Pentagon. And then following that, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense in the Department of Homeland Security. And then finally, the last member of our panel will be Walter Lohman, who is the director of the Asian Studies Center in the Davis Institute. The Asian Studies Center is actually our oldest research center, established in 1983, and its research and scholars analyze the full range of policy on East and South Asia. Walter joined us in 2006 as a senior research fellow on South Asia, Australia, and New Zealand. And he is, before he's promoted to director, and he's also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, leading a graduate seminar on foreign policy in South Asia. Before joining Heritage, Walter served as the Senior Vice President and Executive Director of the U.S. ASEAN Business Council for 4 years, where he oversaw the Council's mission of building U.S. market share in Southeast Asia, led multiple delegations of Fortune 500 companies to the region, participated in prominent business and policy forums, and regularly represented the Council in its interaction with ASEAN officials. In the 1990s, Walter was the Council's Senior County Director representing American interests in Indonesia and Singapore. In other parts of his career, he was a Senate staff member. In 2002, he served as the Senior Professional Republican Staff Advisor to Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina, who then was the ranking Republican on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And from 1991 to 1996, he served as a policy aide to Senator John McCain, during which time he advised McCain on foreign, trade, and defense policies. Excuse me. So with that, let me call Dakota up to the stage, who's going to introduce you to the 2015 U.S. Index of Military Strength.
Thank you. I would point out that Jim was perfectly healthy before they hired me and we started this project, so I think we've done something to put him awry. It was also commented that I really shouldn't need notes, having tried to bring this together for a year, but I want to make sure we stay on track. So without further ado, we'll get into this. You can't really start one of these things without thanking the key people who really made it possible, and it starts with really former Senator Jim DeMint, who said, you know, we've got an economic index. We're well on our way to publishing an index on opportunity and culture here in the U.S., and we need a third leg of that stool that Heritage stands for, and that has to do with a strong country, strong defense, and foreign policy, and so it really initiated that. Dr. Carafano then grabbed that, framed the initial approach to it, and then David Addington, who heads all of our research programs here at the Heritage Foundation, was absolutely insistent that it was scholarly, well-resourced. If you look through the books that you have, you know, it's over 800 footnotes that really undergird the 150,000 words or so. So we're really proud of the effort that the 20 researchers plus have put into it and the various reviewers we've had, and we're really excited to present it. One of the big questions, obviously, is why have an index? I'm not expecting you to read the slide, but if you take these with you later on, we noticed that there really is a gap in understanding the nature of military power. Every administration that comes in, depending on what their priorities are and how much they want to spend, says whatever this is adequate to meet the needs of the country. Every 4 years, we have various studies that come out, QDR, the National Defense Panel, et cetera. Service chiefs come up and provide testimony to Congress and talk about how good or bad things might be going, but it's just a hodgepodge of all these kind of disparate reports, and it is really a problem for members of Congress, for the American public, and for other analysts in town to consolidate it and make sense of it all. So how do you make a reasonably informed decision about the state of affairs and the U.S. military's capacity and capability to really cede to the defending U.S. national interests? So with this kind of a gap, it seemed that very difficult to make well-informed decisions in the prioritization of resources and assets. So having seen that, we thought, well, we could probably help solve that problem and provide a single reference point, a single resource that brings it all together, makes it highly readable, that, again, is scholarly, it's something you can repeat every year, and it acts as a one-source stop for anybody interested in national security and defense matters. And we'll go through the structure of the document and how you'll see that repeat over the years. But what we wanted is in very digestible chunks, somebody could go to one of these elements, one of the essays or pieces, and having read through just 8 or 9 or 10 pages, really get the big takeaway points. So as you hear things in the news media, as Congress is receiving testimony, deciding where to allocate funds, you have a context, you have a reference point on which to make fairly well-informed decisions. You could write entire books on any one of these topics. Nobody reads those, in depth unless you're somebody like, that does this for a living, right? So what service can we provide the country? And we thought that this index would be a great way to go with that. Our approach to the project, just very briefly, you can't really know what you need unless you know why you need it, right? So how do you define U.S. national security interests? If you have 100, then nothing's a priority because you can't cover down on all those things. So what really matters? And we look through various national security documents, top-level guidance from various administrations for the past century almost, and defending the homeland is a big deal. If there is a major war someplace with the potential of destabilizing a region, and it cuts off markets or access to resources or the human toll and casualties, that's a really big deal. And if you have somebody that's trying to exercise hegemonic power, denying access to outer space, cyberspace these days, air or sea spaces, that's a problem for free trade, for the movement of peoples and goods, and the general discourse that we champion here as a country and certainly here at the Heritage Foundation. So those big three things, defending the homeland, prevailing in a major destabilizing regional war of some type, and then preserving freedom in the commons, we thought were three enduring interests of the United States. So if those are the three big ones, then we said, well, who rises to a level to pose threats or challenges at that level? And it's a nice filtering mechanism because you kind of get rid of a lot of little brush fire things that are bad news in their localities. And certainly if somebody's being killed, it's a bad news. But it doesn't really call for the generation and the deployment of hard U.S. military power. So what are the major threats? And then where do those intersect in the world? Our vital interests, those types of threats, and that gives you some regional context. So we looked at threats, interests, the regions, and then if you have to call on the military power of the U.S. to defend those interests against those threats in those various regions, how much do you need? And how capable do you need it to be? So that was the underlying logic behind this project, and I think we did a pretty good job at capturing it. Again, you've got the books in front of you, but there was even some thought in terms of how we formatted the particular document. We wanted it, again, to be logically consistent throughout, to talk about big level things, to provide strategic context. What are the major policies or U.S. interests, or how do we think about national security kinds of issues, and then get into descriptors of strategic enabling kinds of capabilities. So we'll talk about hard military power, but there's massive logistics capabilities behind that, and information, surveillance, and reconnaissance type assets, and strategic enabling forces like sea lift and airlift. So these are kind of topical things that don't fit neatly into a single service, but they're absolutely critical. We wanted to be able to talk about those kinds of things as well. So as we structured it, we led off with these topical essays, which will change from year to year. Since this is the inaugural issue, we wanted to say right up front, how do we think about, or how should we think about national security? And Kim Holmes has written an essay that I think really sets the standard for that. It dismisses a lot of silliness that people lump into national security. It comes down to the hard truths that really should drive our defense and national security planning. Then we got into this question of how much. If you're going to grade the forces on how much we have, you have to have a benchmark. So Dan Garay provided an essay on how historically have we thought about force sizing, how much military power and capability is enough. And again, I think it's a real world-class essay that people will refer to time and again. And then we started getting into some of these key policies. If in fact we're pivoting to the Pacific, there are consequences and implications for that. So there's a lot of fluff there, or does it really mean something? Bruce Klinger on our staff here wrote a great essay on that. You hear about special operations forces all the time now. Well, the things that differentiate them from conventional forces usually are legal authorities and their types of mission sets that they undertake and things they can do and can't do. Dr. Stephen Bucci gave us an essay on those, followed by Michaela Dodge and David and Sarah, who have written some just superb reference pieces. Again, 8 or 10 pages apiece, that if you wanted to understand nuclear capabilities and nuclear power, if you understand cyber and the importance of outer space systems, we've got an essay that looks at that. And then we try to wrap it up with regions that didn't make the cut in terms of the intersection of vital national interests and threats that rise to the level of challenge those, which lie primarily in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, but we haven't forgotten about Africa and Latin America. Huge interests, huge connections with those regions. And Anna Quintana and Charlotte Florence walk us through that and why they're important, why we should be concerned about them, and potential problems that might arise further on down. So that leads us into this whole discussion of military power. And what I'm doing is just showing you some of the items that you'll find in the book. We went back and wanted to be rooted in history. So we think, you know, after something like World War II, where it's just a massive national all-out effort, there are instances of major conventional combat that really stress the United States. And they happen about every 15 or 20 years, regardless of what we try to do diplomatically. So Korea and Vietnam, Desert Storm, Operation Iraqi Freedom are great historical cases where the U.S. invested conventional, hard military power to solve a threat problem. And then you've got a raft of studies going all the way back to the bottom-up review in the early 90s, where you have that one, the quadrennial defense reviews, the national defense panels, a lot of time and effort by talented people to look at these issues of capacity and capability and what the U.S. really needs. And when we put them all side by side, interesting, we found out some consistencies across all those things, which to me, and this is, I think, an important point, neutralizes the element of technology. So right now, and for many years, we've thought that technology would really serve as a substitute for capacity, and in many ways it does, but it doesn't replace capacity. So if you're looking at the investment of U.S. military capabilities from the 1950s all the way up to the current, and you find that you use roughly the same size force, the same number of, roughly speaking, Army brigades, Marine battalions, Navy ships, Air Force airplanes, et cetera, it tells you that regardless of the level of technology, space is a big deal. I mean, in terms of acreage. It takes a certain amount of people to invest landscapes or to control airspace or to have ships in more places than once, regardless of how good or capable that individual or that platform might be. And so what we found in this consistency is it gives us an insight into historically how much military power the United States has used. So for a single major war, when you average it all out, it's about 21 Army brigades of combat power. And we buy into this argument that having two major war capabilities allows you to address an emergent crisis in some region and still have the wherewithal to address one someplace else. And that gives you a great strategic deterrent value to keep opportunism or somebody exploiting that distraction where the U.S. might be very invested someplace else. So just for us, simple math would be if one major war takes X amount, twice of that results in these numbers. So an Army, active Army of 42 brigades, 346 ship Navy. And we look at the number of carriers that repeatedly come up, about 11 carriers or so in just about every study, 5 to 6 carriers usually applied to a major war. And then you see the number of Air Force aircraft, roughly 500 strike fighters in a major engagement, double that. So that's what got us to this point. And realize, though, that if you wanted to have that capability and were actually called upon to invest that, 100% of your force is not always immediately available. You've got stuff, ships that are lay up in yards, readiness levels might be down, you might have presence and engagement activities going on in other parts of the world. So we added a 20% buffer. And what this does is that gives us our benchmark so that when we score the military services relative to their capacity for operations, we wanted to let you know this is where we got those numbers from. So the number is a little bit higher, but not too long ago, just a couple of years ago, in fact, the Army was trying to build the 48 brigade combat teams. The Marine Corps has tried to stay at 27 battalions or higher, and the Air Force acquisition objective is in excess of 1,200 fighters. So again, we're seeing consistency in requirements, what the combatant commanders generally need, and what the U.S. is generally needs to have in its hip pocket to address various challenges around the world. So now getting into the latter three chapters of the index, we took it then starting with regions first, and then threats, and then military capabilities. So whereas we started the intellectual process with interests, and where do threats intersect that, and where does that play out, it's hard to understand the nature of a threat actor if you don't understand the regional context. Who else is there? What's the nature of the geographic constraints? What is allowable? So we wanted to start off by providing context for the region, for the reader. It says these are the key areas of the world, Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, where U.S. vital national interests intersect with threats to those challenges, and where we have either resources or infrastructure or friends and allies to look at. When we assessed these regions, we looked at political stability within the region, the maturity of its national infrastructures, whether it's rails, ports, airfields, roadways, et cetera. Is it easy or difficult to conduct operations there? We looked at the alliance relationships. If you have a treaty alliance, it's more likely that you're going to run to the sound of the gun in support of a defense treaty ally than if you just have a non-treaty friendship of some type. And then the extent that the U.S. is military engaged in that region, either with forward positioned or based forces, regular exercises and all. So we looked through all of that and came up with some of these insights that you see. The big takeaways are, especially with Iraqi freedom and with Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan, we've got about a decade, 12, 13 years now, of great interaction and cooperation with friends and allies that joined us in those efforts. And so with high-level staffs, with operating forces, commonality of equipment and who takes care of what, there's a lot of great experience that comes with that. But over the past decade or longer, 15, 20 years, what we've seen is our friends and allies are underinvesting in defense to a greater extent than even we are. So with 2 million men under arm with NATO countries, 5% of those are exportable beyond national boundaries. When you do have friends and allies that go to a region, and we saw many cases of this in Afghanistan, rules of engagement will differ by countries. Some countries will allow very aggressive use of their forces. Others say, no, you got to stay back and just provide logistical or sustainment types of capabilities. So we see a great variance in the ability and the willingness, the political will of these various countries to use the limited forces they have beyond simple home defense in their own areas. And for us, that poses a real problem. If our national strategy is based on an expectation that other countries are going to, step forward and contribute capabilities, so perhaps we don't need as much, it's a flawed assumption. It's a flawed assumption. So when we walk through the research on this and in the detailed write-ups that you'll have in your hands, great operational capabilities and cooperation over the past decade or more, tragically underfunding in the defense capabilities for these various countries, and then lack of political will to really use that beyond their borders. In terms of the regions themselves, Europe, very mature, very defense, generally speaking, very stable, with the exception of Ukraine and some other areas at the moment. But it's fairly easy for the U.S. to go there and to operate. When we go to the Middle East, the place is chaotic, but we have lots of experience there. We have developed infrastructure. So political stability is questionable, but we know how to do things. In the Asia-Pacific region, it is just so vast that getting from one place to another is problematic from the very beginning. So when we scored that on a very bad, very weak type thing up to a very strong or very favorable kind of condition, when everything was said and done, it kind of comes down into the middle. There's some challenges, but we also have some advantages and opportunities. And so in the mix, things kind of came out to a moderate score. Again, we've tried to include some maps that make sense of the world. This just illustrates how big a place the world can be. It takes 3 weeks to get from the west coast of the U.S. out to the South China Sea, and you can use these kinds of distances and shipping factors in other parts of the world. So if you have a very small Navy, if we're below 300 ships and roughly a third of those deployed, 100, how many in the Pacific, maybe 50 or 60, how long does it take to get a ship from one place to another? How many ports do you have access to? Who can you work with? One thing we noted just this morning is Perth is on the west coast. It's not where Darwin currently is. So we've been working on things for a year, and it's been through many hands. We'll still find elements which chuckle me and drives our graphics guys crazy. And again, another thing that we tried to indicate is maybe some things that are not obvious. The militarization of the Arctic, again, a very hostile environment. But when we look at what Russia and others have been doing, especially Russia, the expectation of shipping channels, et cetera, a lot of investment is going into a region that the U.S. has not operated in. So if you want to continue operating in the Middle East, the Pacific, and Europe, you also have to continue thinking about the potential of going up into the Arctic region. What are the implications for that in terms of U.S. capacities and capabilities? We looked at non-state actors, very violent radical Islamist kinds of groups, Lashkar-e-Taiba, Al-Qaeda affiliates, et cetera, in the Afghan-Pakistan region. And we looked at the destabilizing effects that they can create. So, for instance, a whole raft of attacks by non-state militant groups against, no kidding, Army organizations and facilities in Pakistan. Pakistan is a nuclear power. What happens if the government falls and you have fractured loyalties within their military establishment? What happens to their nuclear inventory? So it's these kinds of things we tried to illustrate via graphics and then also text. And then again, turning back to the Asia region, and you look at developing mature power capabilities that China is fielding. A lot of times you'll hear the phrase anti-access area denial. It's a very short way to say people are investing in capabilities to make it hard for us to get into their neighborhood, to address our own interests, and if we do get in, make it nigh on impossible to be able to maneuver and conduct operations effectively to secure those interests. So China, much like Russia and Iran and some others, is using its strategic depth, a home field advantage, investing mightily in short and medium-range ballistic missile systems to attack things that we have to project 8,000 miles from home. So a very limited number of ports and airfields. China can cover all those with their ballistic missile inventory. You add in very high-level, sophisticated anti-air defense systems, and it makes it problematic for us to get into those kinds of regions. So then when we turned and we looked at the threat environment in particular, we wanted to choose the right words for that. And how do you measure threat? Well, usually it's a mixture of intent and capability. How the heck do you score and measure intent? And we thought observable behavior would be a good surrogate measure for that. So a threat actor, somebody who has been very vocal and antagonistic toward the U.S. or where our interests lie, how have they been behaving in a given year? And what is their capability to follow through on that rhetoric? So you might have China as an example. Its interests don't necessarily align with the United States. It could be quiet in terms of its rhetoric and its posturing one year, but it still retains a fairly substantial military capability, so you have to give it credibility. You could be a non-state actor, extraordinarily belligerent in your rhetoric, but you're developing capabilities to make good on those kinds of threats and prosecute attacks against our allies in Europe and other places. So we accounted for that on this range, and we looked at behavior of these threat actors, China, Iran, North Korea, Russia, and Islamists and other types of terrorist organizations in the Middle East and in the Afghan-Pak region. And we looked at their behavior and, again, their capabilities. And when we sorted all through it, we came that while you've got some weak and some strong in some areas, they're all quite belligerent. And we came up with a middling score on that. As we get then into U.S. forces accounting for those kinds of threats in the environments, we wanted to look at the capacity for operations, the physical capability in terms of its modernization. Is it new gear or is it old antiquated gear and rapidly aging? And then what are their levels of readiness? So do we have the appropriate resources for exercise, for training, to keep these units up to speed operationally? And if you noted in the Senate testimony by the service chiefs just a few weeks ago about the current impacts of sequestration and reduced funding and what all the service chiefs project will be the case in the future, readiness is problematic. You know, half of Army brigades are below acceptance of readiness. Even the Marine Corps has gone to tiered readiness. The Navy is taking half of its cruisers and tying them up pierside because they don't have the resource to sail them and keep them equipped. So things are in a very negative trend, and we looked at each of the services in turn and looked specifically at the nuclear infrastructure because there are different types of criteria that say whether we have a robust, viable, modernized nuclear capability or not. And the U.S. nuclear umbrella covers about 1 billion people worldwide. People rely on us to provide that kind of capability, and if it's in decline, again, that's problematic. So we've got some external and internal pressures that are contributing to this. If you look at constant dollars over time, there are a few dollars being applied to defense in terms of about a 10 or 15% reduction over the years. And then you look at the individual increasing costs inside the services. So people cost more. The things that we're buying, the acquisition profile costs more. So if you want to compare a tank from 20 years ago to a tank today, or an airplane from the 1960s or 70s and 80s to an airplane today, for the same dollar or less, buying the same kind of equipment, I can buy fewer of those end items. Fewer people, fewer tanks, ships, and airplanes. So the trends that we detect and we illustrate in the document are a shrinking military force. The types of equipment we're buying are so expensive that they keep being delayed, either because of technological problems or funding problems. And so the equipment you do have is used more at sustained operations overseas and for longer periods of time. So a shrinking, aging force against this type of world and those types of threats we view as a very negative trend, and it becomes quite worrisome. Because in our view, it's easier to further decline than it is to climb out of the bathtub. It's easier to kick something down the road or to debate over prioritization of resources and the fiscally troubled environment that we're in, instead of applying additional time, resources, and energy to correct those negative trends. So all in all, it's quite worrisome. The Navy is always a great case to show some of the complexity of this, and I just use it as a case here where we look at articulated requirements for Navy platforms of various types, and we looked at the shipbuilding plan and what we actually have in inventory, and we see a declining number of ships. 306 ship acquisition is currently the objective, and 24 below that. It's going to further decline in the next several years before they start an upward trend. Again, we've articulated a Navy, which is supported by so many other studies, of about 346, 350 ships. So a huge gap in terms of the Navy's ability to provide presence. How did we get some of the numbers? Again, it's an exercise almost in futility, but we worked our way through it. The Navy's a great case where you need some capabilities in just terms of presence, being places in the world. If I want to have a carrier forward deployed, I need 2 or 3 back home to provide a rotational base. And the same kind of argument can be made for Army brigades, where you have to rotate them in and out of theater. So we looked at the high-end cases, whether to fight a war, a certain type of platform or unit, or to maintain regional presence and engagement activities that the combatant commanders all clamor for, to deter actions and to reassure friends and allies. And that drove us to the numbers that we arrived at. So if you haven't got my point so far, where we come to the end of this and all this analysis is the U.S. military is rapidly approaching a one-war capable force. So able to handle a major war and then having just a bit of residual capability to handle other minor crises that might pop up or to sustain the types of engagements that are coming on. But it is a far cry from being the two-war force that so many major studies have articulated the U.S. needs for deterrence, for reassurance, and to keep our enemies and competitors from opportunistically exploiting distractions that we might have along the way. In the last part, if you would go to the end of the book when you have opportunity, again, this idea that we try to be informative and educational, we provided an appendix at the back that looks at every major program and capability that the services have. So if you're a member of Congress, part of the general public, an analyst, and you're trying to sort through the status of the multitude of programs that clamor for taxpayer dollars and that Congress needs oversight, audit trails on, et cetera, where do you get all of that? Usually it's sorting through a bunch of Congressional Research Service reports or taking reports from industry or the services themselves. And so we tried to consolidate all these things and then score them. If it's a current program that the military is currently using, it's in the left column, and we look at how modern it is it aging, or is it relatively new and fresh, and what is its current status. If it has a replacement program, a modernization program that's online, it's been approved, and we're applying money against it, how well is that doing? Is it healthy? Is it technologically problematic? Is it good enough in capacity? If I needed 20 ships now, and I'm only buying 10 more, even if those 10 new ships are better in terms of the capabilities, 10 ships can only be in 10 places. And so it's not an adequate substitute for the 20 that they're actually replacing. So we did that for each one of the services. I think it's a great handy resource for anybody interested in the status of affairs. And again, we'll update this on an annual basis. So the big takeaways that I've already addressed as we've gone through the index, we have lots of great friends and capabilities that are out there, but they're underinvesting, and their political will to apply that to security problems where we have a mutual interest is problematic. The enemies that we have out there, competitors, are making very smart investments, accounting for their strategic objectives and interests and their strategic context. They're playing a home game, we're playing an away game, and there are tactical, operational, and strategic implications for that. And then the U.S. military itself is aging, it's shrinking in size, and is quickly becoming problematic in terms of being able to address more than one major conflict. So we think the conditions are ripe for exploitation. If I were Russia or Iran or China or North Korea, I would see the problems that are currently going on in everybody else's theater, how the United States is responding to that, and then making best use of that opportunity. So again, we're concerned that the trends are worrisome, easier to go negative than it is to climb out, and it's really going to be incumbent on Congress to decide where their priorities lie in terms of funding defense for the administration, but this one and the one incoming, to say whether or not a strong America is good for a stronger world and is in the long-term best interest of our country, and if they can make some, we hope, rational and good decisions about the allocation of those limited resources. So that's the index as we put it together. I hope I've covered all the major points. If I've missed something, I'm sure my colleagues will tell me. I see our guest speaker has shown up there, so I'll turn the podium over to Mike Needham, who's the CEO for Heritage Action for America, and look to him to introduce our speaker. So, Mike, thank you.
Thank you, Dakota, and congratulations on an incredible and I think groundbreaking project that the Heritage Foundation has done. We're all extraordinarily proud of this project. It is easy, it's important, but it's increasingly easy for conservatives to point out the flawed policies of President Obama, the way his foreign policy of weakness, the way his foreign policy of leading from behind has made us increasingly unsafe. What is more difficult for us to do is to push back on another threat that our nation faces, and that's the tendency of many in Washington, D.C., including, unfortunately, many of our friends in the economic freedom area, to think of national security as just another line item in the national budget, to think of something that could be cut alongside everything else, as opposed to something that is one of the fundamental and first constitutional roles of our federal government. In some ways, it's not surprising that many members of Congress think this way. There are only 46 House Republicans who currently are in the Congress who served on 9/11. Well over 60% of members of Congress, of Republicans in this Congress, have come in since 2008. The primary crisis that they felt and that they were elected to Congress to deal with was a debt crisis, not necessarily the national security crisis that became clear to us on a beautiful Tuesday morning in 2011. We at Heritage understand that Congress needs to get our country on a sustainable path, but it can only do it while also taking care of that primary constitutional role that we face to address our national security. And to do this, we need to be able to articulate the case for national security in a better way than we've ever done it before. And this index is going to be an absolutely critical tool for all of us in talking to members of Congress about these issues, talking to grassroots conservatives about these issues, by starting with vital national interests, going only then to the threats that our country faces today, our threats that our country faces in the future, going only then to capabilities, and from there talking about the difficult policy trade-offs that members of Congress need to address. This index, as Dakota mentioned, is an important part of a family of indexes that the Heritage Foundation is putting out. Our Index of Economic Freedom, which existed for decades, a new Index of Culture and Opportunity, and of course this Index of Military Strength. And it shows a belief that we have at the Heritage Foundation that you can only be strong at each by being strong at all three. And that strength as a nation requires strength on all three legs of that conservative stool: economic freedom, culture and opportunity, and military strength. Congressman Randy Forbes is the perfect person to talk about this theme, but all three of those themes. As founder of the Congressional China Caucus, he knows that to apply a principled stand on the value of human life, we have to take a strong stand against Chinese human rights violations. He knows that to protect the American private sector investment at home, we must take a strong international stand against intellectual property theft abroad. And he knows that to have a free, prosperous, and secure America, we need to have a strong national defense. Congressman Forbes is the chairman of the House Armed Services, Sea Power, and Projection Forces Subcommittee. His Virginia district includes the Hampton Roads Naval Facilities as well as Fort Lee. He's the recipient of the Army's Distinguished Civilian Service Award and the Navy's Distinguished Public Service Award, both the highest civilian honors each service provides. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Congressman Randy Forbes.
Mike, thank you so much for all you do, and thank you for allowing me to be here today. Dakota, thank you for this great work. We haven't gone through it all, but we will. We're nerdy. We love to read and get into the details, and your presentation is going to be excellent for policymakers to be able to do just that. One of the things I want to do, though, is take you out of the details for just a few moments. And I'll tell you, first of all, let me apologize as I come in this morning.
I am at that point in time in my life where I don't have many filters left when it comes to national defense. I can't be too politically correct. And so if I say anything that may offend anybody here today, I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about somebody that looks like you and may act like you. So let me apologize at the outset for doing that. The second thing, and the reason I want to get out of the details of it, is I was at a dinner a while back with my wife, and the CNO was there, and we were talking the whole evening. And as I left, she looked at me in the car and she said, "Do you guys ever talk in English?" And I realized that sometimes that when we're talking to policymakers and we're talking to the general public, we're not painting the right pictures for them. And so let me just start with a conclusion before I give you the basis of that conclusion, and it's simply this. I believe we're no longer dangerously close to a crisis when it comes to national defense planning. I believe we're in a crisis for national defense. And I want to paint this picture for you. I don't have a nice PowerPoint presentation. Dakota puts me to shame with that, so I'm going to pretend that I've got one, and if you would, this is just a pretend clicker here. And let me click you back to March of 1968. In March of 1968, I was a sophomore at Great Bridge High School, and I was getting ready to give a speech to run for junior class president. You know what my two big issues were? Everybody in that audience were worried about how long the boys' hair could be and whether or not they had to wear socks in their penny loafers. At that time, most people across the country, not me, they were listening to the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. And a guy named James Crew had just graduated from honors from the Air Force Academy. He got married. His family gave him a big celebration. William Cordero had just received notice, he was from California, that he was going to be the father of a new baby boy. Now, I would go on to win junior class president of Great Bridge High School. The Beatles would break up. Rolling Stones would make a boatload of money. But James Crew would never see his family again, never have another celebration. William Cordero would never hold his son because they were both killed in Vietnam. In fact, in March of 1968 alone, we lost 156 planes, 250 airmen, 1,200 soldiers. Altogether in that war, we lost 58,000 American lives, and we lost 3,200 aircraft, almost the equivalent of our Air Force today. Now, I want to take my magic clicker and click you to 1990. And in 1990, I'm being sworn in as a freshman delegate to the Virginia House of Delegates. And in that year, the fourth largest army in the world with some rather sophisticated air defenses would invade Kuwait. And the world would come to us the way they always do and ask us to push back on them, and we would respond the way we normally do, and we would push back. At that particular situation, the estimate for our casualties were pretty high. In fact, we deployed 35,000 body bags. At the end of that fight, we lost 23 planes, and we only used 147 body bags. We returned back 34,853 empty body bags. Now, there are a lot of reasons why, but one of the primary reasons was we were able to establish air dominance in Kuwait that we were never really able to establish in Vietnam. Now, there are a lot of reasons for that. Andy could tell you with a great deal of specificity what they were, but just three of them was we created stealth planes, we had guided munitions and the Tomahawk, we had a jointness capability that we hadn't had before, and on all three of those, there was a lot of pushback from the Pentagon to move in that direction. Now, let me take that magic clicker and click you to today and not give you all the details that you're going to find in this index to back this up. But let me give you the quotes from some of the people that are running that military today, and we'd have that same Air Force walk in here today if I sat down, and they would say, we are dangerously close to no longer being able to guarantee that air dominance that we could guarantee in Kuwait. The second thing is, if you listen to the Army, they will give testimony that we can no longer guarantee. Dakota, you talked about 2 wars. They've testified they can't guarantee that we could win 1 war. And then if you listen to the Navy would tell you that if we get to 260 ships, we cease to be a superpower, we become a regional power. And you pointed out quite clearly that based on their shipbuilding plan, You know, all the build-out is in the last decades or so, and if you took their build-out that they had proposed and we had run with that, this year we'd be down to 274 ships. 11 of those, as Dakota pointed out to you, would have been cruisers that would have been docked or beached, that had their electronics off and their radar off, and they'd be demanded. It would take 18 months to get them back into service. So essentially, you're looking at 263 ships, 3 ships more than when we become a regional power. Now, how in the world did we get in that kind of situation? A lot of reasons for that too, but let me just tell you this one, and let me apologize to you, again, if I hurt anyone's feelings. It's just my conclusion. Liberal thought has always failed when it comes to national defense planning. It's not because they're bad people. It's not because they don't love their country or they're not patriotic. It's because they always focus on one primary element and component, and that's intent. They believe somehow or the other that they can determine the intent of foreign actors, that even perhaps just a tad more arrogantly, that they can forecast what that intent is, and then perhaps even a little worse, that they can influence that intent. Now, while intent is important, it's a component, it's not an incredibly significant component for this reason. Intent can change within 48 hours on almost any actor in the world. Now, the unfortunate thing is conservatives are failing today when it comes to national defense because they're not focusing on the problem. When my conservative friends talk about national defense today, let me tell you what I hear coming from them. They're focused on a $600 toilet seat at the Pentagon. They're focused on a bloated bureaucracy. They're floated on the fact we don't have enough accountability. They're focused on the fact we just don't want to spend those dollars on defense. And they're focused on the fact that we may spend too much on one platform versus another platform, all of which are valid problems. They're just not the problem. And here is the problem, as I see it, with where we are in national defense today. Any good national defense planning comes down to 3 things: strategy, capacity, and capability. And if you look at the world today, the people who may want to do us harm today or in the near future, the curve lines for them when it comes to strategy, capacity, and capability are going up geometrically. And when you look at us, our curve lines when it comes to strategy, capacity, and capability are going down geometrically. And we have got to change those curve lines. Now, here is what's going to happen if we don't change the curve lines. Forget all the indexes. They're important. Forget all of even the statements from these generals. We had testimony before our committee just a couple of weeks ago. You cut it to the raw bottom, and here's where it is. If we don't change those curve lines, we will lose wars that we don't have to lose. We will have soldiers that die that don't have to die. But the third thing is, we could impact our quality of life in such a manner as to really put in jeopardy the very structure of the democracy that we all believe is so important. And let me tell you why. Poor countries, by and large, don't opt for democracies. It's normally countries on the uptick and that are doing well that do. And let me just tell you just a couple of the economics. I was before some of my friends, policymakers, just like you're trying to persuade Dakota the other day. And I asked them, I said, look, we've got 9 choke points around the world. You pick which one we don't want to give up. Is it the Strait of Hormuz? Because if we do, that's 35% of the oil in the world. CIA tells us that if we lose it for 2 weeks, gas prices will go up to $7.50 a gallon. You want us to give up the Asia-Pacific area because if we do, 2/3 of all the trade in the world is going through there for the next decade. Or maybe you want us to give up the underwater cabling that's coming across our oceans because today in New York City and around the world, 97% of all the international financial transactions that are taking place aren't coming by satellite. They're coming by underwater cable. The only Navy in the world that's defending and protecting that is the United States Navy. Or maybe you want to give up 85% of all the goods that are coming across our oceans. That's the kind of thing that is also at stake. Now, let me tell you what will not happen if we turn these curve lines around. There's this myth out there that somehow or the other, if we don't turn the curve lines around, we'll be in less conflicts. Well, Everybody in here that has studied history knows that's not true. But perhaps the best example is sitting right down the road from us in the White House today. Whether you like President Obama or you don't like President Obama, I think one thing we all agree on in here is that President Obama would do anything he could to get out of the Middle East, including sometime to our own detriment, and yet he's about ready to launch the third military effort in the Middle East. The conflicts will come. The question is whether we have the strategy, the capacity, and the capability to deal with them. The second thing that won't happen is you won't be able to buy it back. If you look, we have had $780 billion of cuts to national defense in the last 6 years. That's before sequestration. And if you were to write a check today and I could present it to the Pentagon, I can't buy back what we've lost for that $780 billion. And the third thing is defense won't be cheaper. Everybody thinks, well, I can cut defense. You know, because in this town the last 6 or 7 years, the question everybody's asking is, what do I want to spend on defense? They're not asking, what does it take to defend the country? And the problem with that is, if you don't spend the money when you need to, weapon systems get more expensive, everything costs more. It is more expensive, not less expensive to do that. So what do we need to do to turn these curve lines around? Well, the first thing we've got to do is we've got to begin to articulate the problem and laser in on the problem and get a solution to the problem and not run with all the red herrings that might take us in other directions, because it's going to take all of our energy to do it. Second thing that we've just got to do is turn around sequestration. We can't get there from here with sequestration looming over us on national defense. We've got to get rid of sequestration if we're going to turn these curve lines around. And the third thing is, even after we get rid of sequestration, we've got to get the right numbers. Now, I don't know what the right numbers are. I'll just tell you right today, because nobody does. I mean, I look and I hear people talking about the Gates budget, and look, I would like to have the Gates budget. It's just people disagree. People in this room disagree on what the Gates budget numbers are. You know, so we don't always know that, but let's say it's somewhere around $610 billion. President, it's like $534 billion. BCA caps are $499. Somewhere between that president's budget and the Gates number is where we need to be, and I think closer to the Gates number than the president's budget if we want to begin to turn these curve lines around. And then let me tell you the final thing that's incredibly important. And Andy, you know, we've talked about this at the hearing the other day that you were so gracious to be there for us. We've gotten away from strategic thinking in our country. And I don't care what we have with capacity and capability, if we don't have the right strategies, it's not going to work. And we have got to come back as a Congress and as a people and begin to once again think strategically if we're going to be able to do what we need to do for national defense. We simply can't buy our way out of this. And the best answer, and I know all of you have remembered it from your history, but I think about President Eisenhower, you know, when he comes into office, because that would be my final click to you today. If I could click you back to 1953, when he's sworn in, I'm celebrating my first birthday. And he's being sworn in, but this is what he's looking at. He's looking at an economic downturn in the United States. He's looking at the fact that the Russians had done 4 nuclear tests. The Chinese have, China's turned communism at that particular point in time. He's looking at the fact that the Russians had 175 divisions and 125 in reserve, and he had 29. And the Truman administration is saying, we need more money. We need more money for defense. And what did Eisenhower do? He created, as you all remember, Project Solarium. But he looked not for his friends at the Pentagon, guys he'd served with, but he looked at the private sector. And he actually set up 3 groups to compete with each other and actually make presentations. And then, you know, he created the new look, which ultimately saved $7 billion. But it held the Russians off for a decade. I have people all the time that ask me, well, what do you want to do, create in Congress a new Department of Defense? And I quickly come back, I said, no, we don't want a new Department of Defense. We want a Department of Ideas. We want to be able to have the best thoughts, the best minds competing against each other so that we have the right strategies to go with the capacity and capability to defend and protect the United States of America. And let me just close with this. If we're able to turn those curve lines around, then I don't think we're going to hear music playing like they do in the movies. I don't think we're going to probably see headlines because it's going to be a slow turn in how we fight to do it. But let me tell you what I think the end product will be. You and I will know that we have succeeded in doing what generations of Americans before us have done, and that is to defend and protect the greatest nation the world has ever known. Not a bad day's work, not a bad career opportunity if we can get it. So let me encourage you to stay in that fight to turn these curve lines around. Dakota, thank you for what you're doing to do that. Thank you all for letting me be here with you today.
Really appreciate the work the Congressman is doing to get the curve lines turned around, and we hope that we can be influential in that. I was remiss by not acknowledging Mr. Marshall, who has really graced us with being here today. I spent a couple years working for him in the Office of Net Assessment. If you don't know Mr. Marshall, he's spent 40 years working for every president since Nixon and all their secretaries of defense. The office, as a director of Office of Net Assessment, just retired here this past January. I guess they'd finally had their fill, or you had their fill of them. But it was a great mentor for me, and has really influenced a lot of what we did to approach this index and how we put it together. So I know it was a real rushed 30 minutes to try to get through this so we could preserve your time and get the congressman up here. What I'd like to do is call up my colleagues here, Dr. Bucci, and where's Niall at, and Walter Lohman, and really this is just an informal free-for-all. So happy to take any questions about the index and our approach to it, how we thought about it, the details behind it. You have in front of you just real duty experts in regions, types of military operations, and again our approach to that. And if something is more generalized, I'm happy to answer that question as well. And we'll just start. We have microphones here near. Okay, so if you got a question, hold up your hand and we'll get it to you. Yes, ma'am. The microphone back in.
Hi, I'm Isabella Leo. I'm an intern at the Heritage Foundation. So my question is actually on Obama's strategy on the Asia pivot. So when I first heard about the term of Asia pivot, I was living in Brussels 2 years ago. And the top levels officials at the EU were very concerned about how the European interests would be harmed if Obama is actually going back to Asia. However, when I moved back to Singapore last summer, lots of security experts in Singapore were very concerned about the situation in ASEAN right now because they don't think Obama has actually delivered what he promised 2 years ago. So my question is, and I actually threw the same question to now current U.S. ambassador to Singapore, and he actually diverted this question to the commercial side, saying that actually we're doing on trade well with trade and economies, but he avoided my question on the military side. So I think I'm going to throw the question again to the panel, and I'm wondering, how would you assess the Asia pivot that's been going on in the past 2 years? What would you actually declare it a failure that nothing has actually been done in the past 2 years? Thank you.
I think we'll start with Walter.
Well, I think to begin, I'll just say the Asia pivot generally is an important statement of U.S. commitment to the region, and it's this administration's formulation of that commitment that goes back now, at least in current form, 70 years or so. But I would characterize it as probably similar to how the Singaporeans would characterize it. It's vastly under-resourced and overhyped, and those are on the military side, and those are the two things that you don't want at the same time. That is over-promising and under-delivering, because our potential adversaries and our competitors in the region will very much notice that. There is an economic component to the pivot, but that has not yet been delivered. That's the really the big bang of the TPP when it is done and faces its fate in Congress.
I'll just throw out, we need to pay more attention to Asia. America it just in its normal citizenry don't really get Asia unless you live on the West Coast. So we need to pay more attention. So it was a great intent, but then didn't really do anything. I mean, we've had the same forces there. The preponderance of American forces are actually in Asia or in that theater, and have been for a long time. The problem was it was sort of predicated on a hope that if we said we were going to pivot to Asia, we wouldn't have all these really horrible things going on anymore in the Middle East, and Europe was totally at peace. There was nothing going on there. Of course, then Mr. Putin kind of screwed that up for the president. The reality is America is still a global power. We need to have the ability to respond in all these major areas, particularly Asia, Europe, and the Middle East, and we really can't afford to swing our weight into one or the other in excess, because we have to be able to deal with all three. That's what being a global power is all about.
Yes, and I would add to that. I have to say, you know, the Obama administration is very big on gimmicks and spin, very short on delivery, really. You know, the Asian pivot, frankly, really hasn't, you know, meant an increase in resources in terms of the U.S. military presence in Asia. I would say that it has been used as a sort of cover to do less in Europe. And we have seen that over the last few years. We've seen a significant reduction in the number of U.S. forces based in Europe. We've seen the rise of a resurgent imperialist Russia. And the U.S. response has been the Russian reset, which has basically been, frankly, a policy of appeasement towards Moscow. And that's been an absolute disaster for the United States and for Europe as well. We need to see, I think, the United States investing more in Europe, ensuring that the threats are being met adequately. We're simply not seeing that today. And I have to say, over the past few years, I mean, the Obama administration has really ignored a lot of major developments in Europe. They've undercut key allies in Europe. They paid lip service to transatlantic alliances. And what we have seen is the rise of a menacing dictatorial power in Moscow that is extremely aggressive, but there hasn't been an adequate U.S. response so far.
Others? Sir?
Good morning. My name is Arnold Zeitlin, and I've taught and reported from Asia for quite some time. It's possible to hear a void. I hear a void in the discussion this morning, and maybe there's more in the index that I haven't read yet. But I hear nothing about defense of North America, and I'm wondering if you can address that. I'm assuming that people believe that using the military in other regions will defend North America, but is in fact that the case in view of radical or terrorist threats that exist that could happen in North America?
I'll go first on that one because I'm responsible for Homeland Security here for Heritage. We actually, in our initial discussions of the index, we were going to have a section that was going to be the fourth region we looked at was the Homeland. And then we realized that everything the Department of Defense does, our nuclear strategy or our nuclear deterrent capabilities, our missile defense capabilities, our cyber capabilities, in addition to the more conventional view of tanks, airplanes, and ships, are all ultimately designed to protect the United States of America itself. Now, we tie to that our interests abroad. Even though, as Dakota pointed out, we have to play these away games, we actually prefer to play away games than we do home games. We don't want to play here. And we wanted this to focus primarily on the Department of Defense, which in the Homeland has a supporting role to other departments in the U.S. federal government. So we did not focus on that as a region in the same way we did the Middle East, Asia, and Europe. But obviously we cover a lot of those areas. Our missile defense piece is covered in there. Our nuclear deterrent piece is covered. and our cyber area as well. And we touch on the threats of terrorism that come from the different areas, even though terrorism doesn't rise to the same sort of threat as, say, an imperialist Russia is playing. But it's one that bears enough attention that we give it. So it is in there. It's just not as blatantly in there as some of the other regions.
You don't think you'd be forced to play some home games?
The Department of Defense will be forced to support others in playing some of the home games potentially if we don't keep our strength up overall. That's a potential, and that's always the danger. Is if we get weak enough, then people can start to play more here and less over there, and that's what we're hoping to stave off.
Yeah, let me add to that because it's a great platform to talk about things. We assessed hard military power capabilities within the assessed year. So we didn't get into futures projections, what would the military be in 2027 or whatever that might be. So this is an annual assessment, and then we'll report on changes from, last year to this year or this year to next year. So we would look at it that way. When we looked at this Homeland Defense, Homeland Security aspect of it, the U.S. has been blessed with geographic isolation in many ways. We don't have a belligerent power to our north or to south or wanting to pour brigades or what have you over our borders. In terrorism, it's largely an intelligence community and law enforcement issue in many, many ways, right? So if you looked at how many brigades, attack aircraft, Navy destroyers we might need in a hard military power capability, it doesn't seem particularly relevant to an al-Qaeda-inspired plot to detonate a suicide bomber in Times Square. I mean, so we tried to scope and scale things appropriate to measuring the adequacy of hard military power within the U.S. services.
And again, not to discount that threat. We're not saying, as, say, the Clinton administration and to some degree this administration, that terrorism is just a law enforcement issue. It's not a military issue. It is a military issue. But in the domestic context, the military is in a supporting role to those others. We support it quite a bit, but they do not take the lead domestically in those areas.
We had a question in the back, I believe. No? Yes, sir.
Yeah, Otto Kreischer with Sea Power Magazine and a few other advanced publications. Going through, haven't obviously got a chance to read the whole thing, but looking at the summaries, I think the problem you guys had obviously took you some time to develop, to write this thing, and some of your information seemed to be outdated. But I was looking at the Navy side, and some of the programs that you referenced in there, things have already, have passed over the horizon. So just that's one question as to, can you keep your index really current given the time it takes to assess all the factors? And the other one, I was a little, noticed that the Air Force, you gave the Air Force a fairly high capacity score, when their numbers of actual tactical aircraft that they can deploy, is and factoring in the age is one of the lowest it's been in their history.
Yeah, again, we were historically based on the numbers of aircraft that the Air Force has actually used in major combat operations, and that's why I thought that the data set that we used was very, very good. Certainly a service could ask for more. It's always nice to have a buffer in that respect, but the basis we used for the 2 war plus that 20% as a strategic reserve was the benchmark we set. If it's above that, that's great. When we talked about the health of the Air Force in terms of its modernization aspects and the average age of aircraft, that's certainly in display. But against the benchmarks that we had set, the numbers come out as they do. As far as currency, the first time out the chute is always problematic. So most of the research and the writing was complete in September, I believe, or October. But we wanted to really get this good in terms of its formatting, the methodology structured right, how we were going to put it all together. The next year's index will be on track to publish in the fall, And again, it will be an assessment of that current year. So a lot of the things that have happened globally and domestically in the U.S. with defense budgets, there are a lot of things that happen in November, December, January, and we'll never be ahead of the news headlines. But I think in the next volume, published again in the fall, it'll be much more current along the lines that you discussed. Yes, ma'am. And then next on the side.
Nadia Chao from Liberty Times, Taiwan. My question is that like the Councilman Randy Forbes just mentioned, this current government focusing a lot on the intent of PLA or other country that potential threat. I'm just wondering, do you want to give an assessment what U.S. has achieved so far in regard to the military exchange with China? There are so many dialogues that can go and visit, but what's the tangible achievement you have seen? If you want to make a recommendation for the next president, what he should focus on. And the third question is the deteriorating balance in cross-strait in Taiwan Strait. Do you see any sign that really worry decision makers in Washington? Is there become a irreversible trend developing there? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, Director of Asia Studies Center. So Walter, it's back to you.
Well, in terms of the balance across the straits, I mean, any number of studies document that worsening every year and talk about trend lines and curves. It doesn't look very, very good. It should be something that worries American policymakers. I don't think that it worries the current administration quite enough. I mean, you look at what they've done for Taiwan in terms of arms sales. We've gone now for 5 years or so without any major notifications to Congress of arms sales. All of the arms sales they made good on, and they can point to good billion-dollar figures on how many they have made good on. All of those pledges were made during the Bush administration. This administration has not provided any new major initiative except for the upgrades of Taiwan's F-16s, which was itself a compromise for not giving them brand new F-16 CDs, which is what they need. They need numbers. They don't just need an upgrade of 20-year-old aircraft. In terms of the dialogues that the U.S. has with the PRC and on military political issues, frankly, I don't think they're doing very much at all. I think it's important for us to talk to the Chinese, and I think at the very least, those forums provide a chance for us to sit down and talk to them. But in terms of transparency on the Chinese side, something that they should be aimed at achieving, you get very little from that. In terms of restraint, imposing some sort of restraint on the Chinese for their behavior, particularly in the maritime commons, I don't think you get very much at all on that. We do achieve some agreements once in a while. We just had these 2 MOUs signed in the fall with them that remain very vague and without any clear application to the actual problems in the region. And then all of those forums are hostage to Chinese whim. So every time we do make an arms sale to Taiwan, what's the first thing they go after? They go after those dialogues. Because from the Chinese perspective, their participation in those dialogues are something they're doing for us. They're not something that we're doing together for the benefit of stability in the region generally. They're a give to us, and so they want us to give something back. So when we give arms to the Taiwanese, they see that as, we're not fulfilling our side of the bargain, they're not going to participate in the talk. So a recommendation I would have to the next president is to cut down substantially on the number of dialogues we have with the Chinese. We have, across the board, 60 to 80 or so dialogues. I mean, it's to ridiculous proportions right now. We're not getting very much out of it. And I would also start to hold those talks at risk ourselves. When we get upset about something that the Chinese are doing, like building new islands in the South China Sea, we should tell them, no talks in Hawaii this year, until you can get this together.
Here, and then I need to go to the right. So, gentleman here on the end. No, I need to go over here.
Thank you. My name's Dick Kaufman. I'm a retired CIA officer and also served in the Marine Corps many years ago in Vietnam. What I'm hearing, and at the risk of overstating this and oversimplifying this, what I'm hearing is, as in terms of a solution, we need more mass. We need more airplanes, more tanks, more people, more weapons. Is there any thought, and I know there's thought out there, but we don't seem to go anywhere with this, making our systems and our equipment simpler and cheaper? I tend to look at this in a historic sense, and the Russians were able to, in part, turn back the Germans in World War II because they did that. They made their weapon systems simple, their tanks simple, their airplanes simple, interchangeable, interoperable. I remember when I was in Vietnam, and an F-4, which was the state-of-the-art airplane, was something like $10 or $11 million a piece.
Right.
We're not going to get more money, but we need more things.
Yeah, I'm a fan of an 80 or 85, 90% solution in numbers that can sustain attrition and sustain operations over time than a 100% solution that's so expensive I can only afford a very few numbers of them. So there is an internal contradiction in how we define a requirement and then pursue a solution to that requirement. And that is, we look at what a competitor is doing and peg that as your pacing threat, whether it's a fifth-generation fighter or a hypersonic missile or whatever that is. And we say, to be able to survive in that environment, I need something at least as good, if not better, to be able to do that. We pursue that high-end technological solution. It's extraordinarily expensive, very technologically complex. I find that I can only buy a few numbers of them after a great delay in the production cycle. And again, it goes back to this shrinking, I think, a brittle force where presumably to have the capability I need to combat the enemy that I think I might have to go against, I now have a force that's so inadequately sized that I wouldn't be able to suffer any combat losses at all in prosecuting that threat or that conflict for which I'm planning. So, I mean, there's this internal inconsistency in that logic. So we have very good stuff that's being produced in very little numbers, and if we actually had to go up against the competitors we think we might need to, you wouldn't be able to sustain operations for very long at all. And I think that's a strategic vulnerability that we're building into our force, into our system. Competitors will increasingly see that. If I were an ally, I'd be increasingly nervous about that. And I think ultimately, as Congressman Forbes had talked about, it's a disservice to the men and women we send into harm's way. So I agree with you.
The other thing is that this document was designed to be descriptive as to what's going on now. We have another project that we're working on called the Renewing America's Military Project. RAMP is our acronym for it, and that will be proscriptive. We will look at ways to fix what's broken, and that's obviously going to be one of the things that we'll look at.
We had some question or two over here. Sure.
Thank you, gentlemen. Justin Goldman, RSIS in Singapore. On the South China Sea issue, could you speak about the access challenge, the state of EDCA in terms of the Philippines, the issues that, particularly going forward in the next administration, and the deterioration with the Praith government in Thailand? And on the amphibious issue, did you incorporate any of the early experimentation or use of mobile landing platforms, any of that, to cover some of that shortfall? Thank you.
Walter first.
Well, I get, right now in terms of U.S. access in the South China Sea, there's no real problem. I mean, the Chinese challenge physically to U.S. shipping is not significant. But I think what we're talking about in the index is trying to project out and to see how those things will change over time. And if you'll just look at the numbers there, 60% of where we're going in Navy in our shipbuilding budget to the Asia Pacific is actually less than 50% that we're sending there right now. So I think over the long term, that's what we're worried about in terms of access. There are issues with regard to how close we get to the Chinese shores and things like that that Chinese often protest, and I don't think that's changing. I mean, our commitment to freedom of the seas and freedom of navigation as the United States has understood it through successive administrations and formulated it is not going to change. Neither is the Navy's freedom of seas operations that they conduct. On the Philippines and Thailand, well, I think we'll just have to see how the agreement with the Philippines sort of plays out. It's done. It's a matter of identifying facilities and the operational details of how we rotate through the Philippines. But I think that will it will happen. It's just a matter of working it out and getting through the Philippines' own political environment. It's a democracy too, and there's a very vocal minority opposed to our plans. But I think that we'll weed our ways through that. And then with Thailand. You know, it's a difficult one because you just have to make trade-offs. And, you know, as much as I am concerned for the fate of democracy in Thailand and the need for it to get back to civilian government and to a democratically elected government in the near term, we do have some other things that we have to continue to work on. I think continuing with the Cobra Gold exercise with Thailand was the right call. And we just have to take those on a one-to-one basis. Thailand's not the only undemocratic ally we've ever had. So I think we can work with them. And the amount of time and energy that we have put into that relationship over decades is not something I think to squander based on the verities of the political situation any given day.
So I've gotten a signal that we've got a hard stop here. Real quickly on the amphib side, the Marine Corps has consistently said they need 3 MEB left, the 3 Marine Expeditionary Brigades to cover down in various regions in their different situations. It takes about 17 amphibs to lift a MEB, so 17 times 3 is 51. You know, that's within the bracket we looked at. I think it's awesome that they're looking at alternative platforms, but ultimately it comes down to, is an amphib a combatant? Is it operating in a threat environment? What do you want the capabilities of the ship to be? Can it handle helicopters or MB-22s, or does it have a well deck? I mean, what can you actually do off the platform to accomplish a meaningful military objective for which you would project the force to begin with? So I think the amphib numbers in the 40s up to 50, conventional combatant types of ships are an absolute necessity. Again, it was a 3.0 capability, then it was down to a fiscally constrained 2.5, and then 2.0, and right now the Navy's only able to sortie about a 1.7 capability. So fairly disastrous if you want to do anything with land power projected from a sea environment. And it's a situation we're grappling with. The shipbuilding budget really requires about $20 billion a year to get to that 306 ship Navy. Right now they're at 13 or 14 billion. So those problems just accumulate over years and it'll be in worse and worse condition. So thank you so much. We're absolutely out of time. We've got another event coming in here. We appreciate your attention and taking time out of your day on a very cold day, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have after this.